All right, if you will, go on ahead, open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11. Glenn messaged me this morning. Brother Frank has moved into that stage where he is not responsive to the nursing staff, and his breathing has become very shallow. So continue to keep Brother Frank, but especially Glenn and Mary and the rest of the family in prayer. And then Judy Dukes messaged me yesterday and asked for prayers for Dwayne, for continued strength and healing for him. So if you'd be mindful of that. And then Sister Katie is out sick this morning. Emmy was out sick last week, and Katie's out sick this week. So I know it's not COVID, and just sick. You can get sick from other stuff other than COVID these days, contrary to what the news would have you to believe. And camera, don't say it. In some places, if they do an autopsy and they swab and they test positive for COVID, even if it was a car wreck, they're putting it down as a COVID death. So, so just be mindful of that. And that's why, we talk about faith, because faith is a good antidote for fear. And Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 12. We had looked at Noah last time, and now we move into the father of the faithful, Abraham. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, in him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. And so verse 8 begins by reminding us that by faith Abraham obeyed. And this is one of those that we've tried to kind of drive home. Obedience to what God says is not works. Obedience to what God says is faith. You say, but brother, if he wouldn't have gotten up and walked out to go where God told him, he wouldn't have received God's blessing. That's right. So why did he get up and go? Because he believed the promise of God. Years ago, I don't know, it was somewhere around 500,000 acres that ultimately ended up burning. But they were getting ready to issue an evacuation order for where we lived in Texas. And because it had moved up to the river, and they were afraid that it was going to jump the river. And the vehicles got covered in ash. We've been getting covered in ash for a couple weeks. But it finally reached the point where the smoke cloud and you could see some of the flame off in the distance from it. And a lot of people were actually going to Dallas, fleeing their homes. And someone asked us if we were going to evacuate, and I said, well, if it crosses the river, because the river where they were expecting it to jump was about a quarter mile wide. I said, if it crosses the river and picks up enough speed, I said, I've still got 5 miles of space between the river and the house. I said, so until it actually does that, I said, no, I'm not going anywhere. And you say, well, what ended up happening? the wind shifted and it pushed it back towards the unburned area, and it only took them another 6 months to put the fire out. Now, why didn't I leave? Because I didn't believe their report. I didn't believe their report. If I would have believed it, and say, no, we had a contingency. Dogs, some key documents, and a couple of other Second Amendment possessions, and then get in the vehicles and go for a drive. Not that big a deal. But you have this thing with faith that if you actually believe what God says, it manifests in an action off of what he says. Intellectual belief is not the same as faith. Intellectual belief is not the same as faith. And so when Abraham obeyed, if you remember Genesis 12, what was he told? God said unto Abram, get up from thy country and from thy family, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, and go to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and whoever blesses you I will bless, and whoever curses you I will curse, and in you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Abraham had a couple of tangible things that were out there. That God would make of him a great nation, that God would bless him, and that God would give him a home of his own in a different land. And he believed, and so he started walking. Abraham with his father Terah, his nephew Lot, they left Ur of the Chaldees, which is basically the area of Babylon, and they went up to Haran till Abram's father died. And then after Abram's father died, God called them from Haran and took them down to the land of promise. And that's kind of like saying that you went from Atlanta to Miami. Now, is there a difference between Atlanta and Miami? I know it's a trick question, Brother Tommy. There is some difference. There is some difference. Now, if you had to go on foot and you'd never been to Miami and you paused in Valdosta for a few years and then you had to pick up and go again, would that require faith? Absolutely. Especially if you didn't know where Miami was, because you hadn't been told it was Miami. You'd never been there before. And it was a change in the terrain and a change in the climate. And so he went out not knowing where he was going, to a place that he would receive as an inheritance. For whatever reason, Abram had no inheritance in the land of his father. We don't know why. We do know that when it came time for Isaac to have a wife, Abram said, don't take a wife for my son out of these pagan people in whose land we're dwelling. And then when Isaac needed a wife for Jacob, God used Esau to strongly motivate Jacob to send him back to that land. And so his family had inheritance there, but for whatever reason, we don't know why, Abraham had no inheritance in that land. But here's the simple process of faith. How many of us remember the account of Naaman? Do you remember what Naaman's servant said to him when Naaman was mad? Do you mind putting us in remembrance, Brother Rich? If you remember.
Go ahead and refresh my memory.
Remember, Naaman was mad. He said, how come the prophet of God didn't come out personally? He sent out his helper. And as Naaman left mad because the rivers in his own country were better, his slave servant said, if the prophet would have told you something great and fancy to do, would you have done it? And he said, absolutely. He said, then why not do this simple and insignificant thing? And Naaman, and this is why I know Naaman was a smart guy, Naaman almost let his rank as a commander in the military interfere with his blessing from God. Naaman went down to the River Jordan and dipped 6 times, and nothing happened. And when he went down and dipped that 7th time and came up, it says his skin was like a baby's. No more leprosy. Part of why we look at these. Now we can look at Noah and say, Noah did something great. He built that huge boat. Well, that's true. That's true. But if God would have said, build a tree house, and Noah would save him and his family by building a tree house, you go, well, that's not that big a deal then. Which is greater? To raise someone from the dead, or to build a boat for 100 years and have everyone ridicule you when you say the end of the world's coming? Which is greater? To restore sight to the blind, or to curse a fig tree that dries from the roots up by the next day? How much faith do you think Abel had when he gave God the sacrifice he wanted? More than, less than, or equal to a mustard seed?
Equal to.
All right, I've got to vote for equal to. And that's the right answer, Brother Tommy, for one simple reason. It takes the same amount of faith to offer God what God asks for as it took for any of the miracles that Jesus did, or the apostles. When the apostles couldn't do something, what did Jesus do? He rebuked them. Why? For their little faith, or their no faith, or their lack of faith. You know? Which means in those instances, they didn't even have mustard seed. I think it takes mustard seed to start out building a barge, a big wooden river barge that has to be able to stay afloat for basically an entire year and have enough supplies and everything else for all the animals, all the people. And then it takes faith to stay in it. One of the nice things about America, if you want decent ice cream, where's a good place to go that's close by? Without going to Gainesville. I didn't know High Springs actually had a pretty good little ice cream candy store. It's just right there off of 27, right there at the town square. Well, last night after supper, Catherine and I looked at each other, and I'm like, I don't know where I want to go. I just don't want to sit in the house for the next 3 hours. before we go to sleep. And so, Rum Raisin River State Park, Rum Runner, Rum Island, that's it. Rum Island. There's a lot of rum history in Florida from what I can gather. But if you know where Trent lived, you go down that road, you get all the way down there, you turn left, then you make another right, and you go back to where the road dead ends, and it takes you to Rum Island State Park. Now, it said it was open with no COVID restrictions, but then you got there and it said it was closed for renovations. He said, "What'd you do?" I said, "Well," I told her, I said, "I think this road, 27, I said, I think it takes us into High Springs. If it does, let's go on ahead and go over there and we'll get some ice cream." He said, "What's the point of this story? Do you understand how blessed we are? That if you don't want to sit in your house and you've got $5 or $10 in your pocket and gas in your tank, if you just want to drive to town and get a cheeseburger or a soda, even though you could buy a 12-pack of soda less than what a soda will cost you at most places, since they've now gone to $3.99 for a Coke in a lot of places. But the beauty of it is you can. Can you imagine Noah with his boys, his wife, and his daughters-in-law, and all those animals? That the furthest he can get away and go anywhere is 300 feet roughly. And he can hide on the first, second, or third deck anywhere in that. You say, well, his wife might have had that same feeling too. I bet she did. 3 daughters-in-law and sons? Mama, you don't know what she's doing. Son, we're on a boat in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of smelly animals and no showers. What do you want me to do? I can only imagine those conversations. Do you know what your son did? Oh, poor Mrs. Noah. Nowhere to go for a year. And I still feel bad for Noah the first 7 days, because you go back and you remember, it says God told them to get on the ark, and then and he left them in there for 7 days with no rain, no nothing. Can you imagine what his family was saying to him on the inside and what the people were saying on the outside before the rain started and the fountains broke up? And Noah didn't climb out the window to escape his family after a year being stuck in a confined space. Who understands that's faith? I believe God is going to take me to a new world, and we're all going to get off this boat. Yes, Lord. He said, now he couldn't even say, thank you, Jesus. He didn't know Jesus. All he could do was use the generic name for God. The fact he stayed in that boat for that long, and we don't think about what those kind of conditions are. But if you could never leave, say, 150 feet from the center of your house for an entire year, and you had no more shower water, and you didn't have central plumbing, can you imagine the conversations? No estate. We know some of the conversations that Abraham and Sarah had. And I would beg of you, when you read these people's accounts, always remember what James 5 said to us about Elijah. Elijah was a man subject to like passions, subject to similar emotions as us. Abraham and Sarah fought. You say, I don't know about that, brother. I do. Abraham and Sarah fought with each other. Because at some point, about 12 years into it, the fight ended up with her saying, go get my slave girl pregnant. When that kid comes out, it'll land on my knees. That'll be a legal adoption. That kid will be mine. Otherwise, you're not going to have peace till I get my kid. And you say, why would Abraham have done that? Probably because he was wore out. And then he's stuck between a Hagar and a Sarah, at that time Sarai, with an Ishmael, that before Isaac can come, he has to send his son that he's known for those 13 years away with that boy's mother. Who understands his heart was breaking that day? Anybody? No. Do you believe when you read the Bible that the heroes of our faith, male and female, they had heartbreak, they had heartache, they had anger, they had confusion, they had doubts? The reason they're heroes is because in spite of all those things, they stayed the course until it was finished. I don't know how long it takes a woman to complain about walking, not having a clue where we're going. I know how long it takes me in a mall before I say, how much longer do we have to stay here until you figure out where we're going and what we're doing? I know the other side of it, though. One time we were coming back through Oklahoma. On the map, it looked like it should have been just 7 hours later. We were almost back up to the Kansas line. Catherine gave out after about 4 hours. So what'd you give out on? Busted my chops. Because by the time she gave out, there was nowhere else left to go that would have shortened it any more. The lesson I learned, just go around Oklahoma. Cover to Arkansas and go up, cut across Kansas, just go around Oklahoma. Go through New Mexico. Just avoid Oklahoma. Brother Tommy, you've traveled to Oklahoma. I know you learned one big thing. Never try and come through Dallas in the middle of the day with a trailer in that nastiness of what? 3 interstates and 6 other highways that all converge in a 1 mile area.
Not in the middle of the day.
Definitely not in the middle of the day.
Middle of the day, not the day.
5 o'clock.
That's right, that's right. It was 5 o'clock on Friday. Now about the only good time is between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I learned that because I'd always schedule my VA appointment, to be there when the doctor first got there. That meant I had labs at 6 in the morning. I did that just so I could avoid the traffic going in. But can you imagine 100 miles of walking into it? They've left 2 good homes behind. Abraham holds to the promise. And that's why Hebrews 11:9 says, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country. We sing that song, "This World Is Not My Home." Why was Abraham able to dwell in the land of promise that God was going to give to him and his descendants as an inheritance? Why was he able to live in it like he was living in a foreign country? Has anybody else ever thought about leaving America to go live somewhere else? All right, I got some votes for no. If Canada still had free speech and would let me take my guns, I would go live in Western Canada, far enough north where there's no people. Because they speak English, their money system is basically the same. How many could contemplate living somewhere else for the rest of your life other than Florida, but stay in America? I appreciate the head shake, sister. I still think about Sister Helen Dukes when she told me that for 2 years she lived in Gainesville. She came back to Union County and she was fine if she never left again. Well, you see, in America, we forget, because it's called the United States, but it's 50 different little countries. It really is. In America, and because Catherine has friends that she converses with that live over in Europe, it's one of those Viking nations that's at the top, that her friend and her acquaintance live in one of those southern countries that's off of the Med. That in our head we think, oh, they went from England to Spain for holiday. Like that's a big deal. That's like going from Missouri to Alabama. It's not that big a deal. We see Europe as all these countries, but do you realize America is bigger than Europe? Most of our states are bigger than most of the European nations. You know, when you go to California, you have entered an entirely different country. I mean, on their flag, they still have Republic of California. I mean, the three most unique states, four if we want to include one other one, the three most unique states are California, Texas, and Florida. You know, and if we want to include the most cursed of them, it's New York. Those four states set the agenda for entire chunks of the country. But each one is very markedly different. So when you think about it, if you wouldn't want to leave Florida, and I've met enough people here that they have this belief of not going further south than the northern edge of whatever county Orlando is. It's like, yeah, no, you don't want to go south of there, brother, because then Florida gets whatever. And I've met more than a few that if Tallahassee area were to develop a fault line and accidentally sink into a big sinkhole, they would kind of be fine with it. And you know what that should teach us? Some people are amazed when they find out I was born and raised in the state of Colorado. I'll use the O this time. I always tell them that before it was Colorado, I was technically born in what had formerly been the Republic of Texas. So I was still Texan by geography. Because in my heart, I knew I did not want to be Coloradoan. But everybody in the church that I was raised in was Texan and Oklahoman, cattlemen and oilmen. In the military, guys called me Tex. In Colorado, people who knew I was born in Colorado called me Tex. We've lived in how many states, babe? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 in our marriage. Texas twice. Thank God Colorado only once. Missouri's like Oklahoma. The best place is the middle, no matter which way you're heading out. Because once you start moving like that, and this is the shift of faith I would ask all of us to consider. Home is not where we lay our head physically. Home is where we walk with the Lord in trust. And that's why Abram was able to dwell in the land of his promise like he was living in a foreign country, because he realized that his home was not a physical location, but his home was where the Lord was with him in blessing.